The wine goblet was empty. Not untouched. Empty. And Alpha King Kael Draven could not explain why that bothered him. The annual Founders' Feast was the grandest occasion the kingdom produced. It happened only once a year, a celebration older than the palace itself, older than Kael's reign, older than most of the noble houses whose banners now hung from the vaulted ceiling of the great hall. Hundreds attended. Nobles draped in embroidered silks. Generals who carried their wars inside the lines of their faces. Foreign delegates who smiled with their mouths while watching with their eyes. The servants moved between the long banquet tables with the kind of seamless efficiency that only years of practice could produce. Musicians played from the stone balcony overhead. Towering iron chandeliers held dozens of candles, and everything beneath them glowed gold: the goblets, the serving platters, the polished buttons on the guards' coats, the surface of the wine. Everything was exactly as it should be. Perfect. Orderly. Controlled. Royal. And yet, something was wrong. Kael sat at the head of the central table, his broad shoulders wrapped in a black ceremonial cloak trimmed with silver wolf fur, the crown of House Draven resting at his brow. His attention should have been on the visiting ambassadors who were discussing trade routes with increasing urgency. Or the Eastern generals waiting for an audience about border patrol reports. Or the stack of succession proposals still requiring his signature. Any of those things would have been appropriate. Any of them deserved his focus. Instead, his eyes kept returning to the goblet beside his plate. Empty. Not half full. Not forgotten in the way cups sometimes were. Empty, with that particular finality that suggested it had been empty for some time, long enough that no one had come to refill it. The realization moved through him slowly, like cold water finding its way through cracks in stone. Kael stared at the silver cup and frowned. That wasn't right. The thought arrived without warning, and without explanation, yet it arrived with the certainty of something simply known. Someone always filled it. Before every feast. Before every council meeting. Before every private dinner where he sat alone with his thoughts and his correspondence. Someone had always made certain his goblet was never empty. It had been true for so long he had stopped noticing it, which was perhaps the point. Some kindnesses became so reliable they disappeared into the architecture of daily life. You only found them again when they were gone. His gaze lifted and moved across the crowded hall. The servants moved efficiently between tables, pouring wine, replacing dishes, collecting empty plates, yet no one approached his seat. No one glanced toward him at all. As though the head of the table had become invisible. A strange pressure gathered behind his ribs. Kael Draven did not concern himself with trivial things. He commanded armies. He negotiated treaties. He settled disputes between rival pacts that other men would have let bleed into open war. An empty cup should not matter. An empty cup should have no particular weight at all. And yet it did. The sensation only grew. Not pain, exactly. Not fear. Something quieter than either of those, something he had no ready name for, something that sat inside his chest and refused to be dismissed the way other discomforts could be. He reached for the goblet and turned it slightly in his hand. A faint ring of dried wine clung to the inner silver surface. Someone had poured into it earlier in the evening. Then it had simply been left there. Forgotten. Abandoned. The word arrived on its own. Abandoned. For reasons he could not have explained, it unsettled him more than the empty cup itself. A foreign diplomat was speaking. Something about northern shipping tariffs, something that normally would have commanded his full attention. Kael realized he had not heard a single word. Not one. His mind had not wandered, it had not wandered anywhere at all. It had simply stopped at the goblet and stayed there. And then a second realization arrived, sharper than the first. Someone always arranged his place setting. Someone always adjusted the napkin beside his plate. Someone always placed fresh flowers near his seat before a formal occasion. Someone always arrived before him and ensured that everything was prepared, everything was precise, everything was ready. He had never once sat down to a table that wasn't already perfect. Not in years. But tonight, there were no flowers. Kael went still. His eyes moved across the polished oak surface. No flowers. Not a single bloom. The table stretched empty between the platters of roasted venison and the silver serving trays, and the place where the arrangement should have been sat bare and vacant, and a strange ache moved through him, small and unwelcome and impossible to locate precisely, as though it were coming from somewhere underneath ordinary feeling. Who handled my table? The question appeared before he could stop it. He frowned and tried to follow it to an answer. Who did handle his table? The answer should have been obvious. Simple. A name, a face, a brief image, some thread of recognition connecting him to the daily work that kept his private world in order. Yet nothing came. No face surfaced. No name arrived. Only blankness. The same blankness sitting inside the silver goblet. The same blankness sitting where flowers should have been. The same blankness quietly expanding through his chest. Across the table, Lord Varian laughed at some joke Kael had missed. Servants wove their way between rows of guests. Life in the hall continued exactly as it always had. Yet Kael felt, with sudden and inexplicable certainty, as though he had stepped slightly outside of it, as though everyone present was in possession of some piece of information he had never been given, and they had all agreed, without discussing it, never to tell him. His jaw tightened. The sensation annoyed him. It confused him. More than anything, it frightened him. Not because of what he knew. Because of what he didn't. Slowly, the Alpha King set his goblet down. The sound it made, silver meeting wood, was small, but several nearby conversations paused in response. Briefly. Almost imperceptibly. But Kael noticed. His eyes narrowed. He turned toward the nearest servant, a young woman carrying a tray of wine, who froze the moment his gaze found her. That wasn't unusual, most servants became nervous in close proximity to the king. Yet something about this reaction felt different from simple nerves. She looked almost guilty. Come here. His voice carried no particular volume. It didn't need to. She obeyed immediately. The closer she came, the more the guilt became readable, in the tightening of her fingers around the tray, in the slight quickening of her breath. Kael studied her carefully, and for reasons he could not name, his unease sharpened rather than settled. Tell me something. The servant swallowed. Yes, Your Majesty. Kael gestured, toward the goblet, toward the space where flowers had not appeared, toward the low, strange wrongness sitting over the table like weather before a storm. Who handled my place setting? The servant blinked. Once. Twice. Color left her face. The hall seemed to become quieter around them, not silent, but quieter, the way a room becomes when something has shifted in it and the shift is felt before it is understood. Kael noticed several nearby nobles stop speaking. A pair of servants exchanged uneasy glances. One of the generals at the end of the table lowered his eyes toward his plate. The reaction was immediate. Instinctive. And deeply wrong. His heartbeat slowed in that particular way it always slowed before battle. Before betrayal. Before news that would require something irreversible of him. The servant looked at the floor. Then at the nobles. Then back at the king. And her eyes held something that took him a moment to identify, because it was the last thing he expected from someone looking at the most powerful man in the kingdom. Pity. His stomach tightened. Answer me. Her voice emerged barely above a whisper, careful and fragile, as though the words themselves required handling. Because she isn't here anymore, Your Majesty. Silence. Complete silence. And for the first time that night, the Alpha King understood with full and terrible clarity what was wrong. He had no idea who she was. The word settled over the founder's feast like ash after a fire. Because she isn't here anymore, Your Majesty. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The musicians on the balcony continued playing, but even their music seemed to arrive from somewhere far away, muffled beneath the invisible weight that had descended on the hall. Kael studied the servant's face. She immediately dropped her gaze, not from deference, but from discomfort. The distinction unsettled him. He understood the difference between a servant who would not look at their king out of respect and a servant who could not look at him out of something that felt closer to shame. His gaze moved slowly through the room. The nobles weren't looking at him. The generals weren't looking at him. Even the servants who stood posted along the walls had found something fascinating in the floor, the ceiling, the middle distance, anywhere that wasn't the king's face. A tension had entered the hall that had not existed a minute ago, born from a single question and a single answer, and now it sat over everything like a held breath. Kael rose from his chair. The scrape of wood on stone rang through the chamber, and conversation died entirely. Every head turned. He stood at the center of the feast, and for years that sight alone had been sufficient to produce immediate, unquestioning attention. Tonight, the silence that answered him felt different. It did not feel respectful. It felt guilty. As though everyone present knew a truth they had hoped would stay buried. His eyes returned to the servant. "What is her name?" He heard his own voice ask it before he had decided to. The servant went rigid. Across the hall, something small and metal fell against the stone floor, a spoon, by the sound of it, and the tiny clatter seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet. Still no one answered. Kael felt irritation rise, then confusion, then something colder and harder beneath both of those things. Because this was not normal. If a servant had committed theft, someone would say so. If she had died, someone would say so. If she had simply been dismissed for poor work, they would say that without hesitation or shame. But they stood there. Watching him. Silent. As though the truth was something that might require him to be steadied before they delivered it. His gaze moved through the room until it found the one man who had, in all of Kael's memory, never lied to him. Calder. The king's beta sat 3 places below him on the left side of the table, broad-shouldered, gray-eyed, jaw marked by a scar from a war fought 15 years earlier. A man who had followed Kael into battles that would have broken lesser wolves. A man whose loyalty had never, in all that time, given Kael a single reason for doubt. Calder met his gaze. And for the first time in Kael's life, the beta looked tired. Not the physical tiredness of a hard week. Something worse. Something that lived deeper than muscle or bone. The expression lasted only a second before it was controlled and put away, but Kael had seen it. And the sight of it made the unease in his chest spread further. Calder. The beta set his goblet onto the table. The movement was deliberate and careful, like a man about to step onto uncertain ground. "Your Majesty. Who is she?" The question hung in the air between them. Calder's jaw tightened. Nobles shifted in their seats. A servant near the far wall closed her eyes briefly, as though bracing for something she had long known was coming. "Answer me." The command moved through the room like a change in weather. And then Calder exhaled, slowly, the way a man exhales when he has decided he can no longer protect someone from a truth they need to hear. He stood. Every eye in the room followed the movement. The beta looked older tonight than Kael had ever seen him. Not in his face or in his body, but in his eyes, where grief lived. Old grief. The kind accumulated over years of watching something unfold and being unable to stop it. The sight frightened Kael more than any enemy he had ever faced. Her name was Elara. The name landed. Not with complete unfamiliarity. Not quite. Something inside him shifted at the sound of it, a faint, restless pull, like hearing the first note of a song you should know but cannot place. He turned it over silently. Waited for recognition to catch up. Waited for memory. Nothing came. The absence felt wrong in a way he could not articulate. Profoundly, inexplicably wrong. Elara, Kael said aloud. The name felt strange against his tongue, and yet the moment he spoke it, the ache behind his ribs deepened. That startled him. Why would a name he didn't recognize cause pain? He searched his memory with the same thoroughness he brought to anything: no face, no voice, no conversation, no image. Nothing at all. Only a room whose furniture had been removed. You said she isn't here anymore. Calder nodded once. She resigned, Your Majesty. The hall seemed to tilt slightly. Kael blinked. Resigned. Servants resigned every year for any number of ordinary reasons. A resignation should not carry this weight, should not produce this silence, should not turn his most loyal man's eyes into something that looked like grief. When? 3 months ago. 3 months. 3 entire months. Kael looked at the beta and the words became real in a way they hadn't been in the first moment. 3 months and he was only noticing now, noticing the absence, noticing the empty goblet, noticing the missing flowers. As though her departure had begun as a murmur too quiet to hear and had only tonight, at this feast, accumulated into something undeniable. If she truly meant nothing to him, why did 3 months feel wrong? Too long. Far too long. Like a word on the tip of his tongue for so long it had become a kind of ache. His eyes drifted back toward the goblet. Toward where the flowers should have been. Toward the space beside the serving corridor that he had not, until this moment, known he was capable of missing. Who was she? No answer came immediately. Kael's voice hardened. I asked a question. Calder met his eyes. Then said the thing that made every witness in the room go still. She worked directly for you. Kael frowned. Directly for him? That was impossible. He would remember a woman who worked in direct service to the king. Surely. Wouldn't he? He searched again. Found nothing. The absence was becoming something painful. Doing what? Calder's expression shifted, the look of a man deciding to stop protecting someone from the truth. He drew breath. She prepared your chambers. A pause. Organized your correspondence. Another. Maintained your private study. Another. Managed your personal staff. Another. Arranged your meals. Another. Selected the flowers placed on your desk every morning. A pause longer than the others. Maintained your travel records. Prepared your ceremonial attire. Each sentence arrived separately. Each one struck somewhere specific. Because Kael recognized every task. Not Elara, he recognized nothing when it came to Elara. But the work. The results. The consequences. The way his study always looked exactly as he needed it. The way his correspondence was always organized before he reached for it. The way his chambers always smelled of cedar and fresh flowers in the morning, and his goblet was always full, and his cloak was always prepared, and his life moved with a smoothness he had attributed to the general efficiency of a well-run palace rather than to any single pair of hands. He knew the work. But not the woman. The realization struck with sudden and sickening force, like a hammer dropping onto stone. He had benefited from her every single day, had depended on her labor and her care and her attention, and somehow had made her as invisible to himself as furniture. As wallpaper. As the air in a room you only notice when it's gone. He felt something turn over inside him. His voice emerged quieter than before. More uncertain. What did she look like? No one answered immediately. The silence itself was an answer, a hesitation born not from ignorance but from a reluctance to say the next thing. Kael turned to Calder. The beta looked devastated. Genuinely devastated. As though the question itself caused him pain. And suddenly Kael wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Because he was beginning to understand. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to sense the shape of something terrible approaching. The room remembered Elara. The palace remembered her. The servants, the guards, the general who had looked at his plate, every person in this hall carried some memory of her. Everyone except him. What did she look like? The question came again. Almost a whisper now. Calder looked at him for a long moment. Then spoke, slowly, carefully, the way you handle something that might break. Dark hair. Gray eyes. Quiet voice. Kael waited. No image rose. Only emptiness. Cold. Absolute. The kind of emptiness that, in this moment, felt worse than grief, because grief at least required memory of what had been lost. He suddenly understood what was wrong. Not with the hall. Not with the feast. Not with anyone in this room. With him. He could recall battlefields from 20 years ago in precise detail. He knew the names of foreign kings he had never met and the exact wording of treaties he had signed before he turned 30. He remembered the weather on the day of his coronation, the scent of rain in the palace courtyard when he was 12 years old, the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder before the man died. Yet he could not find the face of a woman who had apparently stood beside him for 7 years. 7 years. The number reverberated. 7 years. And he had no face to put to the name. Only absence, enormous and cold and, he was beginning to understand, entirely his own. Before pride could silence the question. Before the king could reassert himself. Before anything else could intervene. He asked the thing he had become terrified to know. Why does everyone look at me like that? The silence that followed was the longest yet. Then Calder spoke. Barely above a whisper. You saw her every day, Your Majesty. The words landed softly. They hit like something much heavier. Kael went completely still. The beta held his gaze. You simply never looked. The words did not echo through the great hall. They didn't need to. They entered Kael's chest and stayed there, heavy, fixed, immovable. For several seconds, he simply stood at the head of the founder's feast while hundreds of people watched him and said nothing. Because something had changed. The most powerful alpha in the kingdom had just been confronted with something no enemy had ever managed to accomplish. Not doubt in his strength, not doubt in his rule, but something that cut considerably deeper than either of those. Doubt in himself. He waited for Calder to soften the statement. To tell him there had been some misunderstanding, some failure of memory, some reasonable explanation. Calder offered nothing. He simply held his king's gaze with that devastated, tired look, and the silence confirmed what words alone might have allowed him to dispute. The ache behind Kael's ribs deepened. Like a blade turning, finding the gaps between his certainties. He looked around the hall. The faces around him seemed subtly different, though nothing about them had changed. The nobles avoided his eyes. The servants looked uncomfortable. The guards posted along the walls wore expressions he had not noticed before, pity, not for a defeated king, but for a man who had somehow stood in the center of something important and failed, repeatedly, to see it. Kael no longer wanted to be in the hall. The feast felt like it was closing around him. The music from the balcony was wrong, somehow, too cheerful, too oblivious, too far from what was happening in his chest. Without a word, he turned and walked away. No one stopped him. No one tried. The enormous doors opened and closed behind him, and the cold quiet of the corridor arrived like water over his face. He breathed. Barely. You simply never looked. The sentence followed him through the palace, through torchlit hallways, beneath stone archways, past servants who pressed themselves to the walls when they heard him coming. It turned itself over and over inside him, looking for a way to be wrong, finding none. How was that possible? How could a woman spend 7 years working directly around him and leave behind nothing? No memory. No image. No voice, no face, no conversation, not even the brief impression of a presence he could have misidentified. Nothing. A name, and a name alone. Kael remembered everything. His memory had served him flawlessly for his entire life. He remembered battles from his youth in specific detail. He could name the commanders of armies he had defeated. He remembered every treaty he had signed, every negotiation he had won, every meal at which an alliance had turned. He remembered the weather on the morning of his coronation. Yet when it came to Elara, there was simply nothing. As though someone had entered a room in his mind and cleared it. The realization followed him all the way to his private chambers. When he entered, the room felt different. Not because anything in it had changed. Because for the first time, he was looking at it, truly looking, in a way he apparently had not been doing for years. The chamber was designed for a king. Tall windows overlooked the city. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A stone fireplace crackled softly. The room smelled of cedar wood and old parchment. Everything was immaculate. Everything was ordered. And standing in the middle of all this familiar perfection, Kael found himself asking a question he had never thought to ask before. Who keeps it this way? His eyes moved to the desk. In all the years he had worked at that desk, the reports sorted, the documents arranged, the correspondence organized so precisely that he could always find whatever he reached for, he had never questioned the mechanism behind that order. It had simply been there. It had always simply been there. He approached it slowly. The wood gleamed in the candlelight. At first glance, nothing unusual. Then he noticed, near the edge, a faint circular stain, small enough to be almost invisible, worn into the wood over what must have been months or years of repeated use. His fingers touched it. A vase had sat there. Frequently. Consistently. The ring was too defined to have come from occasional placement. Someone had put flowers on this desk every single day. The memory of Calder's words returned without invitation. Selected the flowers placed on your desk every morning. Kael stared at the mark in the wood. An ordinary water ring. Nothing more. And yet it hurt in a way he could not have explained, because he could almost picture it now, almost, but not quite. A vase. Fresh flowers. Arranged by someone who came in before he arrived each morning. Someone who had hoped, perhaps, that he would notice. Someone who had placed that small piece of beauty in his path, day after day, and received nothing in return. Nothing. Then his eyes found something else. In the corner of a shelf, nearly hidden, a wooden box, small and plain and unremarkable. He had no memory of placing it there. He opened it. Inside lay dozens of dried flowers, pressed carefully between sheets of paper. Lavender. Wild roses. White daisies. Bluebells. Each preserved with extraordinary care, each bearing a small label in a handwriting that was elegant, precise, and entirely unfamiliar to him. And every label carried a date. He stood for a long moment looking at them. 7 years of dates. 7 years of flowers. 7 years of mornings when someone had arrived before him and put something beautiful in his path, and he had set it aside without looking and gone on with his day, and she had pressed it into paper and saved it anyway. Kael sat down. The chair felt harder than stone. Something was forming inside him. Not memory, memory was still denied to him, still blank. But understanding. Understanding, he was beginning to realize, was in some ways worse. Because memory could be stolen or broken or simply lost. Understanding belonged entirely to him. The next discovery arrived with a servant named Helena. An older woman, one of the senior staff, who entered carrying tea and stopped completely when she saw the king sitting with the flower box open in front of him. She looked at the box. Then at him. Her eyes filled with a quiet, helpless sadness. "Your Majesty. What is this?" Kael asked, though he already suspected. "The flowers." She said it gently, as though she were speaking about something that deserved gentleness. "You found them." "Found them." As though they had been waiting for precisely this moment. As though they had always known they would eventually be found. Someone expected me to. A hesitation. Then, she hoped you might. The ache behind his ribs sharpened again. Always the same direction. Always back to Elara. She collected these. She brought one every morning. Helena paused. Even when it rained. Another pause. Even when she was sick. Another. Even when everyone told her to stop. Kael looked away. Something in those words sat on him with a weight he hadn't expected. What happened when she gave them to me? Helena swallowed. Then corrected herself, almost without seeming to notice she was doing it. He would set them aside. He. Not you. As though she couldn't bring herself to attach the action directly to the man sitting in front of her. Without looking. The room felt colder. She always smiled anyway, Helena added quietly. The image struck him somewhere unprepared. A woman smiling after being ignored. Not once. Not twice. For years. He could not make himself picture her face, still, but he could feel the shape of what that must have looked like, the deliberate lifting of a smile, the choice to make it, the stubborn refusal to let the indifference take the morning from her. Why? What kind of person did that year after year? As the evening stretched toward midnight, more answers came. The palace steward revealed that Elara had reorganized the household supply routes, and the adjustments had been saving thousands of gold coins each year since she implemented them. The head cook told him that the tea blend he had been requesting every winter for the past 4 years, the specific blend he favored, was something she had created for him when he was sick, and he had never asked who made it, and he had never been told, and he had never thought to wonder. A captain of the guard described how, after an assassination attempt 3 years earlier, the ceremonial cloak Kael wore for his next formal appearance had been damaged. It had reappeared in his wardrobe days later, perfectly repaired, with no record of who had done the work. He had simply put it on. A physician mentioned that medicines had appeared outside the king's chambers every time he fell ill, anonymously, uncredited, always the right thing for what ailed him. Every road led back to her. Every kindness. Every quiet act of maintenance. Every improvement that had made his life easier or his kingdom run more smoothly. Everything he had received without question and attributed to no one in particular. The palace was built, in ways he was only now capable of seeing, from her fingerprints. Yet somehow the hands that left them had remained invisible to the one person they were most trying to reach. By midnight, Kael found himself sitting in the palace kitchens, which was the last place anyone would have expected him to be. The cooks had finished their work. The ovens had cooled. A handful of servants remained, and every one of them had a story. One remembered Elara helping a young scullery maid learn to read in the evenings, quietly, without being asked. Another remembered her paying for medicine out of her own wages when a servant's child fell sick and the family couldn't afford the physician. Another remembered her staying through the entire night preparing food for a company of soldiers returning from the border, wounded, cold, arriving without warning. The stories didn't end. They multiplied. Every servant in this palace loved her. Every guard respected her. Every kitchen worker had some memory stored with particular care. She had spent 7 years making everyone's life easier, including his. Especially his. And no one, in any of the dozens of conversations Kael sat through that night, could remember him once doing anything equivalent for her. Near dawn, he sat quietly while 2 elderly servants spoke beside the kitchen hearth, neither realizing they had an audience. One of them sighed. Poor girl. The other nodded. She waited a long time. Too long. The first woman stared into the embers. Then asked, "Do you remember them talking? The king and Elara?" The second woman thought for a moment. Then slowly shook her head. "Not really." A silence followed. Then she added, quietly, "I don't think I ever heard him say more than 2 sentences to her." The words struck harder than any accusation could have, precisely because they were said without anger. Only sadness. Simple, honest, private sadness, shared between two old women who thought they were alone. Not a condemnation. Not a verdict. Just a fact that had been sitting in the palace for 7 years, waiting for someone to notice it. Kael stared into the dying fire. And for the first time, the weight of 7 years began to settle onto his shoulders. Not all at once. One piece at a time. A flower. A cup of tea. A repaired cloak. A medicine bottle. A sorted letter. A kindness offered to a man who never looked up to see who was offering it. The palace remembered every detail. Except him. The silence stretched. Then a young kitchen servant, barely 18, clutching a basket against her chest, clearly terrified to speak, stepped forward anyway. Because some truths, apparently, demanded witnesses. Her eyes glistened. When she finally spoke, her words shattered the last piece of Kael's certainty. She only stayed because she believed that one day you'd finally see her. The kitchen fell silent. And for the first time since hearing Elara's name, the Alpha King found himself terrified of what he might discover next. The words remained in the kitchen long after the young servant stopped speaking. No one rushed to fill the silence. No one attempted to soften the blow. There was nothing left to soften. The truth had become too large, too heavy, too undeniable for any kindness to diminish it. Kael sat beside the dying hearth while the palace slowly woke to a new day around him. Servants moved through distant corridors. The kitchen staff began their morning preparations. The kingdom continued, exactly as it always had, as though nothing of consequence had happened in the night. Yet something fundamental had shifted, inside the Alpha King, in the place where certainty used to live. He did not feel powerful. He felt lost. The sensation was dangerously unfamiliar, and it followed him all the way back to his chambers. The palace looked different in the growing daylight. Not because the walls had changed, but because he had begun noticing the spaces between things. The absences. The traces left by a woman everyone else seemed unable to forget. When he entered his chambers, dawn was spilling in long gold stripes across the floor. Dust drifted in the light. The room felt expectant, somehow, as though something had been waiting. His eyes moved across the shelves, across the desk, across the familiar geometry of the furniture. And stopped. Near the far wall, a narrow cabinet, made from dark walnut, unremarkable, one he had rarely opened. Yet now his eyes lingered on it in a way they hadn't before. Something about it felt different. Important, in a way he could not have articulated. He crossed the room. The hinges creaked softly. Inside, books, mostly his, military histories, political records, treatises on leadership. Volumes he had accumulated over the course of his reign. And one that didn't belong. A small leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth along the edges, its corners softened by years of handling. No title. No crest. No name. Only a single pressed white flower tucked between the pages. A lily. Kael's breathing went quiet. His hands hesitated over the cover. Some part of him understood, before he opened it, that what was inside would hurt. He considered closing the cabinet and walking away. Let the past stay buried, let the absence remain nameless, let the palace return to the convenient order it had maintained before the empty goblet and the missing flowers. He opened it. The handwriting was elegant. Precise. Thoughtful. The first page held only a date, 7 years ago, the earliest entry, and beneath it, a single line. The bond is real. Kael stopped breathing. He read the words 3 times. Felt the intimacy of them, the raw and terrified hope they contained, someone standing at the beginning of something enormous, committing to paper the thing they were most afraid to lose before it had even properly begun. He kept reading. The early entries radiated a kind of happiness that was difficult to look at directly. Day after day, page after page, hope, excitement, wonder. A young woman recording the experience of finding her mate. A future she believed had finally arrived. I still can't believe it. The moon goddess chose him. Out of everyone. She chose him. I know he felt it too. I saw it in his eyes. Kael stared at the words. A faint ache stirred, not memory, but something adjacent to it. The outline of something that should exist. A shape without substance. He turned the page. And another. Weeks passed inside the journal. Then months. The tone changed, not dramatically, not all at once, only in small increments that you had to be looking for to notice. Small cracks appearing beneath the surface. Today he barely spoke. He's busy. The kingdom needs him. Tomorrow will be better. Another page. He forgot our dinner. That's all right. He looked exhausted. Another page. I brought flowers. He didn't notice them. That's all right too. The words grew harder to read as the pages turned. Not because the handwriting changed, but because the optimism remained, and somehow that made everything worse. Kael could see it happening as though watching it from above, a woman making excuses for a disappointment she didn't understand, constructing reasons that were generous enough to protect her hope, telling herself that tomorrow would be different. Every tomorrow. For years. He kept reading. The entries became less frequent. Longer. Heavier. Year 2. He still doesn't know. The sentence sat alone on the page. No explanation. No elaboration. Just those 4 words and the white space around them. Kael stared at them for a long time because something about the simplicity was devastating, the exhaustion in it, the confusion, the heartbreak, and beneath all of that, something that had no business still existing by the second year and yet did. Patience. The kind of patience only love could sustain. The pages continued. Year 3. I think something is wrong. Not with him. With whatever happened to us. I know he should recognize me. I know he should. I see it sometimes, for just a second, like he's almost remembering. Then it's gone. Kael closed his eyes. He sat with that for a moment. Then opened them and kept reading. Something had changed in Elara's writing by this point. She had stopped recording the experience of waiting and started recording the experience of searching. The entries became investigative, focused, methodical, driven by the kind of determination that emerges when hope refuses to simply give up and transforms into something more rigorous. I've begun researching old bonding records. There are stories, rare cases where magical interference disrupted recognition. I don't know if that's what's happening. But I have to know. I have to understand. The pages that followed were full of notes and cross-references. Healers contacted. Ancient accounts studied. Forgotten rituals examined. Every entry revealing the same thing: Elara had spent years trying to solve the mystery of why her mate could not see her. Not because she blamed him. Because she refused to stop believing in him. She never hated him. Even then. That somehow hurt most of all. Hours passed while Kael read. Sunlight climbed across the chamber floor. He kept turning pages. Then he reached an entry that made his blood go cold. Year 4. Maybe I imagined it. He read the sentence twice. Maybe I imagined it. Not anger. Not resentment. Something worse, the beginning of surrender. The beginning of a woman starting to question her own reality. Not because she had stopped loving. Because she had spent too long loving without an answer, and the silence had begun to do the one thing sustained silence always does eventually. It had made her doubt herself. Kael kept reading. He had to. Stopping now felt like abandonment, like committing, consciously, the same offense he had committed without thinking for 7 years. The final entries were different. The handwriting remained precise. But something had changed in the sentences. They were heavier, more deliberate, written by someone who had arrived at a conclusion she had been resisting. Year 7. I'm tired. 3 words. Nothing else. No explanation. No anger. No accusation. Just exhaustion, the kind that settles into a person's bones after carrying something impossible for longer than anyone should have to carry it alone. Kael sat with those 3 words for a long time. Then he turned the page. And the journal changed again, one final time. The handwriting sharpened. Became urgent and focused. Not emotional. Determined. As though Elara had made a decision and stopped looking backward. The entries referenced the palace archives. Historical records. Royal ceremonies. Missing documentation. Forgotten names. She had discovered something. Something connected to the palace. Something connected to him. Kael sat forward. The final pages described an event from 7 years earlier, the royal mating ceremony, the day the bond should have been publicly recognized, the day that should have been the beginning of everything. Except something had happened. A magical disruption. Chaos. Panic. Witnesses injured. Records destroyed, or so the official account claimed. Elara didn't believe the official account. And the deeper she had dug, the stranger the gaps became. Entire sections of the bonding records missing. Witness statements altered. Names removed. Documents not damaged, not accidentally lost, but removed. Deliberately. With precision. Kael felt a chill move through him that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. Someone had hidden something. Not carelessly. Intentionally. His eyes raced across the final completed page. I've confirmed it. The records were altered. Someone erased evidence from the ceremony. Someone made certain the bond was never recognized. Someone wanted me forgotten. The room felt smaller. Colder. He read faster, searching for the name, searching for the answer, looking for the person who had done this. The next page had been torn out. Kael froze. Jagged edges where the paper had been removed. Careful removal, not a rip in anger, but a deliberate extraction, as though someone had found the journal, turned to this specific page, and taken the one thing that mattered most. Someone had known exactly what Elara had discovered. Someone who had access to his private chambers. Someone with enough power to have avoided suspicion for 7 years. Someone trusted. And somewhere inside the palace, that person was still there. This was no longer a story about neglect. No longer about distance, or blindness, or a forgotten maid who had given more than she ever received. This was something darker than all of that. Something deliberate. Someone had not simply failed to introduce them. Someone had actively, methodically, over the course of years, ensured that the Alpha King never recognized his own mate. And the worst of it was still coming. The realization followed Kael through every corridor of the palace. For 7 years, he had believed his kingdom was secure. He had trusted the people around him with his safety, his schedule, his correspondence, his private chambers. He had trusted them with his life, in ways both obvious and subtle. Now he understood he had also trusted them with something he hadn't known existed. Something they had spent 7 years carefully keeping from him. The journal remained close against him as he moved through the palace archives, where dust hung in the air and ancient shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, holding the kingdom's memory in parchment and ink. Or at least, what remained of it. The royal archivist nearly dropped a stack of ledgers when the king arrived without announcement. Bring me every record related to the royal mating ceremony 7 years ago. The archivist hesitated. Your Majesty, those records were mostly destroyed during the attack. Bring me what remains. Hours of careful examination followed. The records revealed very little, which told Kael everything. Pages missing. Names struck through. Witness accounts that began and stopped mid-sentence. Entire sections excised with such thoroughness that their absence was more informative than anything remaining. And the pattern was unmistakable once he knew to look for it. It wasn't random damage. Random damage was scattered, careless, guided only by chaos. This was selective. Curated. Everything connected to the mating ceremony had been taken. Everything else, military reports, financial ledgers, attendance records, remained intact. Only the bonding records were gone. Only the evidence connecting him to Elara. The next 3 days consumed him entirely. Council meetings went unattended. Diplomatic correspondence sat unopened. The kingdom waited, because for the first time in years, the king had found something he considered more urgent than governing. He questioned everyone he could reach. Old wolves who had served the palace during his father's reign. Men and women with memories stretching back decades. Most offered the same carefully vague answers: the ceremony had been chaotic, the attack unexpected, the records lost in the confusion. Always the same. Always conveniently unspecific. Until one elder hesitated. Just slightly. Just long enough. She was old, wrapped in grey wool, sitting beside a fire in the eastern wing. Her hands trembled with age, but her eyes were clear. When Kael mentioned the ceremony, something crossed her face before she could control it: recognition, followed immediately by fear, followed by caution. "You remember something?" She lowered her gaze. "I remember rumors." "Tell me." A long pause. She stared into the fire as though searching for courage inside the flames. There were whispers after the attack. That the records weren't destroyed. She paused again. Only removed. Another pause. People said someone important had ordered it. Who? The woman shook her head slowly. I never learned the name. Kael felt disappointment flash through him, followed immediately by something else. Hope. Because this was the first independent confirmation. The first voice that hadn't simply repeated the palace's approved account. The first proof that he wasn't constructing a conspiracy out of grief and guilt. Someone real had done this. And no cover as careful as this one was ever completely perfect. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A witch named Idrissa, old and nearly blind, lived alone beyond the southern marshlands in a cottage that smelled of smoke and dried herbs. The journey took half a day. Kael made it without a guard. He told her everything. The journal. The missing records. The forgotten bond. The 7 years. When he finished, she sat quiet for a moment. Then she asked him a question, simple, direct, and the simplicity of it made his stomach clench. When you try to remember her face, what happens? Nothing, Kael said. The witch shook her head. That isn't true. He frowned. What do you mean? Nothing doesn't feel like something. She leaned forward. If she had never existed, you would feel genuine absence. But you're not describing absence. You're describing resistance. A pause. Pressure. A wall where a memory should be. The room was very quiet. You were cursed, she said. The words seemed to stop time. Kael didn't move. Not to forget her, the witch continued. Not to hate her. Something far crueler than either of those things. Her voice lowered. To never truly see her. To look at your mate and your mind would simply slide past. Not recognize. Not register. As though she existed in a frequency you were prevented from hearing. The explanation fit with a precision that was almost nauseating. Every missing memory. Every blank space. Every moment when he must have looked directly at Elara and seen nothing of consequence. Your mind retained the effects, she said. The flowers. The tea. The work. The order of your chambers. The curse didn't take your awareness of those things, it took the source. The person. Kael stared at the floor while the truth settled over him like ice. This curse required maintenance, the witch added. He looked up sharply. What? The spell you're describing isn't permanent. It weakens with time. Left alone, it would have faded, perhaps within a year. 2 at most. She met his eyes. It lasted 7. The implication arrived with brutal swiftness. Someone had renewed it. Year after year. Again and again. Someone with regular access to him, close enough to maintain the working without detection, powerful enough to have evaded every instinct he possessed. Someone trusted. Someone inside the palace walls. The list of people who could have managed that was short. Dangerously short. What followed was 3 nights of the most obsessive investigation Kael had conducted outside of war. Records, schedules, visitor logs, ceremonial calendars, private correspondence, travel histories, he tore through everything, following each thread to its end, comparing dates, cross-referencing patterns. The answer emerged slowly. Then, all at once. Lady Seraphine. His aunt. His father's younger sister. The woman who had spent 40 years engineering political marriages between noble bloodlines, who believed that power was the only appropriate foundation for any union, who had arranged half the alliances sustaining the kingdom's current stability, and who had, in quiet conversations over the years, made her position absolutely clear: the Alpha King's mate should be chosen for what she brought to the throne. Not for what the bond chose. The evidence accumulated with grim thoroughness. Visits to the palace timed precisely to correspond with periods when the curse would have required renewal. Private meetings buried within ceremonial schedules. Payments to practitioners whose names appeared nowhere in official records. Alterations to the mating ceremony documents traced back to orders made the week she arrived at the palace for the occasion. Every path led to her. Kael sat alone in his study long past midnight, surrounded by the evidence. The room was silent except for the sound of his own breathing, measured, controlled, deliberately controlled. Because rage would have been easier than this. Rage could be aimed at something external and released. What he felt instead was grief. Grief for 7 years. Grief for everything Elara had written in those pages. Grief for a woman who had spent 7 years waiting for a man who had been, in a very specific and terrible sense, prevented from being capable of arriving. Seraphine had not simply hidden Elara. She had stolen possibilities. Conversations that should have happened. Mornings that should have been different. The experience of being known, being seen, being chosen, the thing every person with a mate deserves without having to earn it. 7 years of life that could not be recovered. His eyes found Elara's journal again. Then landed on the final page before the torn one. He read the line again. Once. Twice. And a new fear entered the story, sharp, immediate, unlike anything that had come before. Elara had not written, "I'm leaving." She had written, "We're leaving. We." The word lodged in him and refused to leave. The candle beside his desk burned low, its flame trembling in the stillness of the chamber. Outside, the palace slept. The capital lay quiet beneath the moonlight. And inside the king's study, Kael sat motionless while a single word turned itself over and over in his mind. We're leaving. Not I. We. A child. The thought arrived slowly at first. Then all at once, with a force that left no room for denial. A child. His child. Their child. He gripped the edge of the desk. His claws broke through before he could stop them, carving 5 thin marks into the polished wood. If Elara had left 3 months ago, if she had written "we," then either she had been carrying his child when she walked through the palace gates for the last time, or the child had already been born. A life. A person. Someone carrying his blood, his bond, his wolf. Someone who might already be old enough to ask questions he had never been present to answer. The thought nearly brought him to his knees. He had faced battlefield arrows without flinching. He had survived poison, betrayal, the grinding weight of decades of leadership. Nothing in his life, had prepared him for the possibility that somewhere beyond these walls, a child existed who had lived their entire life beneath the same moon without knowing who their father was. Because their father had not been there to be known. He turned toward the door. Calder. The beta was already there. Standing in the corridor, in the shadows, in a posture that suggested he had been there for some time. Waiting for exactly this moment. His face was pale and still and devastating in the way faces looked when they had been holding grief for a long time and the moment of release had finally arrived. Kael knew before Calder spoke. The beta had known. Not everything, perhaps not the full shape of it, but enough. Too much. Tell me. Calder lowered his eyes. Your Majesty. Tell me. The command did not echo. It cut. The beta looked at the journal in Kael's hand. Then exhaled, long and slow. Elara was with child when she left. The words entered Kael like a blade. Clean. Precise. Final. For one terrible second, he felt nothing. Then everything arrived simultaneously, rage, grief, regret, terror, and beneath all of those things, something that had no right to be there alongside them but was, hope. Raw, desperate, terrifying hope. All of it crashing together with such force that his wolf surged against his ribs with a sound that was almost a howl. He staggered one step backward. Calder moved forward instinctively. Kael lifted a hand, not to stop him, but to steady himself. How long? His voice came out rough. Nearly 6 months when she left. 6 months. 6 months of carrying his child inside these walls. 6 months of walking past him, serving his table, placing flowers on his desk, carrying their child and carrying her silence, and carrying everything else she had always carried without complaint. 6 months of hoping he would see not just her, but them. His breathing came unevenly. He saw nothing, no memory, no image, only the devastating geometry of what should have been. A woman carrying his heir beneath his roof while he sat in council meetings and discussed succession alliances as though fate had not already made its choice. He opened his eyes. Where is she? Calder hesitated. The hesitation nearly broke what remained of Kael's control. Where is she? North. The answer came quickly now. Past the Thornmere border. A healer's village near the White Ash Woods. She had relatives there once, or perhaps only friends. We were never certain. You didn't search. We tried. The beta's voice carried old frustration and older guilt. She hid herself well. And after what happened here, many people helped her disappear. Of course they did, Kael thought. The servants. The guards. The villagers who loved her. The world had done for Elara what her own mate had failed to do. It had protected her. Kael was moving before Calder could say another word. Through the study, into the corridor, down the stairs. By dawn he was in the stables, pulling on a riding coat, sheathing a blade at his side. No crown. No ceremonial trappings. No royal escort of any kind. Calder appeared in the stable doorway. Sire. You cannot ride alone. Kael looked at him. I rode alone for 7 years while she stood beside me. The words silenced them both. He looked toward the northern road. The cold morning air moved through the open stable doors, carrying the smell of frost and distance. Now I ride alone until I find her. He rode north. Not as a ruler. Not as a conqueror. Not as the most powerful wolf in the 5 territories. As a man with an empty journal and a missing page, chasing the life he had never learned to see. The first village remembered her. He should not have been surprised. He was, anyway. A small settlement a half-day from the capital, built around a mossy stone bridge over a narrow river. Kael dismounted at the inn and asked his question simply, a woman, dark-haired, quiet, pregnant, 3 months ago. Had she passed through? The innkeeper's face changed before Kael finished the sentence. You mean Elara? The name in a stranger's mouth hit him somewhere specific. A stranger remembered what he could not. She stayed one night, the innkeeper said. Wouldn't take the room upstairs, said another traveler looked more tired than she did. Slept by the hearth. He wiped his hands on his apron. My boy had a fever that night. Terrible one. She noticed before any of us did. Sat with him until dawn and made medicine from herbs she was carrying. He paused. I think she saved his life. Kael stood in the ordinary warmth of that ordinary inn, surrounded by the smell of smoke and bread and wool, and felt it become another courtroom. Another place where a stranger testified to who Elara was. Did she say where she was going? No. But she asked which roads were safest for a woman traveling alone. The innkeeper paused again. Then she asked which roads were safest for a woman traveling with a child. Kael gripped the edge of the counter until the wood creaked under his fingers. Who are you to her? The innkeeper asked. His eyes had narrowed slightly. He was not an unintelligent man. Kael considered the question. Every possible answer felt inadequate. Her king. Her alpha. Her mate. All of those were technically true, and none of them were sufficient. Someone who should have come sooner, he finally said. The second village remembered her too. An old farmer whose bones she had set after a fall from a ladder. A young mother who remembered being taught to brew fever tea. A blacksmith who had repaired her worn shoes and been politely refused when he tried to waive the payment. Every village had a story. Every road had a trace. Every stranger spoke her name with warmth. The palace had failed to see her. The world had loved her. That truth traveled beside Kael like punishment he had not been formally sentenced to but had earned. On the third day, the road narrowed into forest. Ancient trees, dense and heavy with mist. His horse slowed, ears moving toward sounds hidden in the undergrowth. His wolf stirred with something that wasn't aggression, something more urgent, more fragile. Recognition. The ancient pull of bond, finding its direction in the dark. Near dusk, he reached the healer's village. Smaller than he expected. No walls. No banners. No guards. Only cottages scattered between ash trees, smoke rising from chimneys, herbs hanging in dry bundles beneath wooden porches. Children ran through the muddy paths. Women carried baskets. Men split firewood in the last of the afternoon light. Life moving quietly here. Peacefully. Without him. The observation settled in his chest with a strange weight. A woman in a brown shawl saw him first. Her eyes moved over his clothes, his horse, his posture, reading all of it accurately and arriving at a conclusion before he could speak. Her expression closed. You shouldn't be here. I'm looking for Elara. The woman's mouth tightened. Most men are looking for something only after they've already lost it. Kael accepted that. He did not argue it. Where is she? The woman studied him for a long moment. Then looked toward a cottage at the edge of the village, small, white-walled, covered in ivy, with a line of fresh laundry moving gently in the wind and flowers on the windowsill. White lilies. Kael's breath stopped. She had always placed white lilies when she wanted to say goodbye. He hadn't known that until yesterday. He knew it now. And still she kept them. He walked toward the cottage. Each step felt heavier than the last. The closer he came, the stronger the pull inside him grew, his wolf pacing beneath his skin with a desperation he had never felt from it before. Not commanding. Not territorial. Begging. He stopped 10 paces from the open door. Through it, the cottage glowed with warm afternoon light. A kettle steamed at the hearth. A basket of sorted herbs sat on the table. And near the window, her back partly turned, stood a woman. Dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. A simple dress. Steady hands. A face that had been made sharper by years of endurance without becoming harder, still soft in the places where character lived. His wolf recognized her before his mind could fully form the thought. The force of it hit him so violently that he grabbed the doorframe to stay upright. For one terrible moment, the curse tried to reassert itself. Her outline blurred at the edges. The room shifted. The woman before him almost became nobody, almost slid sideways into the peripheral blindness that had kept her invisible for 7 years. Kael's claws dug into the wood. No. The word tore out of him, low, rough, broken. He forced himself to look. Forced his eyes to hold her. Forced every part of himself to resist the blankness trying to swallow her face, because this time he knew what the blankness was. This time he understood what it was trying to take. Slowly, her features sharpened. Her hair. Her hands. Her mouth. Her eyes, gray, quiet, familiar in a way that made no sense and every sense simultaneously. Elara looked up. And when she saw him, the color left her face. Not only from shock. From old pain, the kind that arrives before joy can, because it has had so much more practice. Between them, a small girl sat on the floor, holding a wooden wolf in her hands, looking up with curious eyes. His eyes. Kael stopped breathing. The child looked at him. Uncertain. Unhurried. And smiled, a small, hesitant smile that struck him at a depth he had not known he possessed. His smile. His eyes. His wolf. He felt it, faint, undeniable, the resonance of blood and bond. A daughter. A child who had lived 6 years without knowing his name, because he had not been there to offer it. Elara moved. Not dramatically, not fearfully. She simply stepped between him and the child, one steady, instinctive motion, and Kael felt that movement break something in him more completely than any accusation could have. She had learned to protect their daughter from his absence. From the pain that was attached to him. From the shape of him, even here, even now, even before he had said a single word. Elara. Her name left his mouth like a prayer spoken by someone who had only recently learned what prayer was. She did not soften. Did not move toward him. Did not cry. She stood straight and calm, and wounded in the precise and specific way of someone who has survived the thing that was supposed to destroy them. What are you doing here? The question was quiet. Almost polite. The politeness made it worse. I came for you. Something behind her eyes shifted, a door closing, a wound reopening, some internal reckoning he could see the edges of but not the inside. I came for my mate, he said. Silence. The cottage held itself completely still. Even Lyra stopped moving. Elara stared at him for a long time. Then her lips parted, and the words she gave him were not shouted, not sharp with the anger he would have understood. They were calm. Measured. Devastatingly final. You had 7 years. Kael could not answer. Because she was right. 7 years of flowers. 7 years of tea. 7 years of quiet care poured into a man who never once looked up to see who was giving it. She had crossed years to survive him. He had crossed a border to find her. There was no apology in the world large enough to cover that distance. The little girl stood then, still holding the wooden wolf. She looked from Elara to Kael and back again. Her small brows drew together. Mother. Her voice was soft. Innocent. Entirely unaware of what she had just opened. Who is he? The question remained suspended in the cottage air. Small. Fragile. Devastating. Kael stood in the doorway and felt the world contract to the child standing behind Elara's skirts. His daughter. 6 years old. Holding a carved wooden wolf in one small hand and looking at him with open curiosity rather than recognition, because recognition required something he had never given her. Presence. History. A name said aloud in her direction. He had imagined this moment in various forms during the long ride north. He had imagined Elara's anger. Her tears. Her rejection. He had steeled himself against blame, against deserved hatred, against the sound of her voice finally breaking under the weight of everything she had carried. He had tried to prepare himself for the worst she might give him. He had not prepared for a 6-year-old asking who he was. Not because anyone had taught her to be suspicious of him. Not because Elara had raised her against him. But because absence had accomplished what cruelty could not, it had made him a stranger. Elara looked down at Lyra, and her guardedness transformed immediately. The caution in her face softened as though a different person had briefly stepped forward. This is King Kael. Not your father. Not the man I once loved. Not my mate. King Kael. A title. The formal distance of it was its own architecture, a wall built not from anger but from survival, built to protect the small girl looking up at the large man in the doorway with his curious gray eyes. The little girl studied him with the unself-conscious seriousness only children possess. The king from the stories? Elara hesitated. Just briefly. Yes. Lyra stepped around her mother's skirt just enough to see him better, and Kael's wolf surged forward beneath his skin. Not with command or aggression. With something ancient and desperate and helpless. The instinct to kneel. To hold her. To say her name, even though he did not yet know it. To claim what blood and bond already recognized. He did none of those things. Because Elara's hand tightened at her side, only slightly, and this time, he saw it. He saw her fear. Not fear that he would hurt the child. Fear that he would take her. That the Alpha King who had arrived at her door would exercise the authority of his title and remove Lyra from the life her mother had built. The realization moved through him like cold water. He lowered his voice to something that would not carry threat. What is her name? Elara's silence lasted long enough to constitute its own answer. She owed him nothing, and they both knew it. After a moment, she spoke. Lyra. The name moved through him like light entering a sealed room. His daughter had a name. A face. A favorite toy. A mother who had guarded her with everything she possessed. And he had missed the entirety of her existence. Kael lowered himself to one knee. Not because weakness required it. Because standing felt wrong, too imposing, too much like the king who had failed them both. He kept his hands visible. Open. Empty. I am sorry. The words emerged knowing they were insufficient. They were almost insultingly small against 7 years of damage. But they were the only honest place he could find to begin. Lyra blinked at him. What did you do? The innocence of it was what finished him. He met Elara's eyes. Then returned to the child's. I was not where I should have been. Lyra considered this with the same gravity she seemed to bring to most things. Then she looked up at her mother with a look of pure, practical logic. Is he staying for supper? Elara closed her eyes briefly. The pain that moved across her face was quiet and old and exhausted. When she opened them again, they were steady. No. One word. Soft. Final. Kael rose. The movement cost him more than any battle had. Every instinct inside him screamed to stay. To explain. To beg. To begin now, immediately, making up for everything. But Elara's eyes told him what she would not say. He had no right to demand space in a life she had rebuilt without him. I won't force you, he said. She looked at him steadily. You couldn't. You are right. The admission seemed to move through her like something unexpected. She did not soften, but she held still in a different way. He took one step back from the threshold. Then another. I will remain in the village. He saw her draw a breath to refuse it. I won't enter your home without permission. I won't approach Lyra unless you allow it. I won't ask you to return to the palace. He paused. I won't ask you to return anywhere. She paused at that. For the first time, something crossed her face that wasn't simply old pain. The lines of it shifted, slightly, recognition of a sentence she had not expected. He continued carefully. I came here believing that finding you would be enough. That crossing the distance was the act that mattered. His voice dropped. It isn't. I understand that now. Elara studied him for a long moment. Then looked away. You don't understand anything yet. Not cruel. Accurate. He bowed his head. Then let me learn. She didn't answer. Not that day. She simply closed the cottage door, and Kael stood outside it long after the latch settled into place. The white lilies moved gently on the windowsill. The village went quiet around him. The closed door felt like less than he deserved. It felt like mercy. He stayed. Not in her cottage. Not near enough to create pressure. He took a small room above the healer's storehouse at the far end of the village, where the roof leaked during rain and the bed was too narrow for a man of his frame. No banners. No guards. No visible mark of who he was outside these walls. The villagers watched him with varying degrees of suspicion, disapproval, and silence. Kael accepted all of it. He had entered a place where his crown meant precisely nothing, and for reasons that surprised him, that was exactly what he needed. The first week, no one asked for his help. So he found work himself. He repaired the fence behind the healer's cottage. He carried firewood for the elderly residents. He hauled water from the stream when the pump mechanism failed. He fixed a roof in the rain, working through the evening until his hands were raw and his cloak soaked through and his back ached in ways it hadn't since he was a young soldier. No one thanked him. Not at first. He hadn't come for thanks. He had come because for 7 years, Elara had carried burdens that should never have been hers alone. And now, finally, with no title to hide behind and no crown to grant him authority over anything, he could carry something. Whatever small thing the village needed. Whatever was in front of him. On the 5th day, Lyra saw him stacking wood outside an elderly man's cottage. She stood at a distance, watching in silence. Kael noticed but didn't call to her. He remembered, without needing to be reminded, the look in Elara's eyes when she had stepped between him and her daughter. Do not take. Do not demand. Do not rush. He continued working. After several minutes, Lyra moved closer. Kings chop wood. He paused and looked at the axe in his hand. Then at the distinctly uneven pile he had produced. Badly, apparently. Lyra examined the pile with the frank seriousness of someone conducting a professional assessment. Very badly, she agreed. For the first time since arriving in the village, Kael almost smiled. Almost. Lyra did smile, brief, small, real. Gone before he could properly see it. But it stayed with him for the rest of the day. The second week, Brindis, the village's senior healer, began teaching him. Not because she liked him. She made that absolutely clear, repeatedly, without apparent concern for his feelings about it. You grip herbs like they owe you something, she observed one morning, watching him crush lavender that was supposed to be gently pressed. Kael looked at the destroyed leaves in his palm. They are delicate, she said. Try behaving as though you understand what that means. He did. Poorly at first, then less poorly as the days passed. He learned to grind roots without obliterating them. To bind wounds. To prepare the fever tea he had apparently been drinking for years without knowing who made it. To separate medicinal plants from poisonous ones by smell and texture rather than guesswork. He learned how much knowledge and care lived inside work that no one with a sword had ever thought to respect. He learned how many lives could be quietly, invisibly saved by a woman with steady hands and no audience. Each lesson was another form of understanding. And understanding, by now, had become its own punishment, because every skill he acquired showed him with greater clarity who Elara had been, and for how long, and to what extent he had failed to notice any of it. Elara watched from a distance. She never praised him. Never softened openly or invited him closer. She went about her work in the village with the same calm competence she had apparently brought to everything for years. But she stopped leaving the square when he entered it. Then she stopped turning away when he spoke. Then, one afternoon, when Lyra fell and scraped her knee, she allowed him to hand her the clean cloth. Just the cloth. But Kael held that moment with both hands. Weeks passed. Painful, honest, slow. Lyra began asking questions. Small ones at first, practical questions, curious questions, the kind children asked about everything. Do you really live in a palace? Did you ever fight a bear? Why is your wolf so quiet? Then harder ones. One morning they were sitting beside the stream, Elara working nearby under a tree, close enough to hear. Lyra looked up at him with the directness children deployed without warning. Did you know about me? The easy answer rose first. Kael let it go. No. Why? He looked at the water moving over the stones. Several answers gathered, all of them containing truth, none of them sufficient. Because I was cursed. Because someone hid your mother from me. Because none of what happened was entirely my fault. All true. None enough. Because I failed to see what mattered most. Lyra studied him. Children recognized honesty with an accuracy that adults spent years trying to recover. After a moment, she leaned against his arm, lightly, briefly, the trusting weight of someone who had decided, for now, that this was acceptable. Kael did not move. He barely breathed. His daughter rested against him for less than a minute. But that minute changed something in him that no moment since finding the journal had managed to reach. That evening, Elara found him at the hinge of her garden gate, which had been sticking for weeks. He had not been asked to fix it. She stood watching him for a long time before she spoke. You don't have to keep doing this. He tightened the fitting carefully. I know. Then why? He looked at the gate. Then at her. Because someone should have made your life easier. The words were simple. They were not enough. He knew that. But they were true in a way that the more elaborate things he might have said were not, and he was learning, slowly, that truth was the only currency she would accept from him. Elara's expression shifted, only slightly, only briefly, but he saw it. Pain. Grief. The faintest fracture in the wall she had spent years constructing. You can't repay 7 years with repaired fences. I know. You can't undo what happened. I know. You can't walk into this village and become what we needed back then. I know. Her voice trembled then. Barely. Just for a moment. But you are still trying. Yes. She looked away. Neither of them spoke. The evening moved around them, birds, wind, the distant sound of children in the village square. Then, quietly, almost as though she were saying it to herself. That makes it harder to hate you. She went inside. Kael stood by the gate for a long time after the door closed. Not with hope exactly. But with something that occupied the same space hope would eventually fill. The curse broke on a rainy morning. Not with lightning. Not with ceremony. Not with any of the drama that had seemed to define the 7 years that led to this one. It broke over a bowl of porridge, in the middle of an ordinary village meeting about flood damage and repair plans, while the rain tapped steadily against the windows and someone passed around tea. Kael sat near the doorway. Elara sat across the room beside Lyra. He was close enough to be present, far enough not to impose, the careful distance he had maintained for weeks. The meeting went on. Someone spoke about timber. Someone else mentioned a compromised foundation. The village's practical conversation flowed around him. Then Lyra leaned up and whispered something into Elara's ear. And Elara laughed. A small laugh. Brief. Soft. The kind that escaped without permission because whatever Lyra had said had simply caught her off guard. The sound entered Kael like a key turning in a lock he had not known existed. The world stopped. Not around him, inside him. Something cracked. Then another crack. Then another. And the blankness that had held for 7 years, maintained by someone else's magic and his own unwitting blindness, shattered. All at once. No transition. No gradual warming. 7 years of Elara arriving simultaneously, with the force of everything that had been prevented from reaching him for that long. Flowers on his desk. Wild roses. Bluebells. Lavender. Her hand placing them carefully, stepping back, waiting. Her smile when he passed without looking. Her hand withdrawing from the place near his sleeve where it had almost touched him. Good morning, she had said, every day, and he had answered without hearing. Tea at his elbow. A cloak across the back of his chair. Medicine beside his bed during the fever that had laid him out for 3 days in the 3rd year. A meal in silence, her watching him with the patient attention of someone who had given up expecting to be watched in return. 7 years of her face. Her face. He could see it. He could see her, sitting across from him at his desk, arranging his correspondence with hands that moved with quiet precision, looking up when he entered a room with eyes that carried something she had spent years learning to keep carefully behind. Gray eyes. The same eyes Lyra had looked at him with beside the stream. He had seen her every day. He had simply never looked. The bowl slipped from Kael's hands and shattered on the floor. The room went silent. He tried to stand. His knees struck the wooden floor before he could manage it. He pressed one hand over his mouth, as though that could contain what 7 years of compressed absence felt like arriving all at once. It couldn't. A sound came out of him that was nothing like the sounds he made as king. Raw. Broken. Human in a way that surprised him by its force, as though the grief had been waiting in a room of its own, behind all the control and the title and the years of not looking, and had simply walked out. He looked across the room. Elara was standing. Pale. Trembling. She knew. He could see that she knew, the expression on her face was not confusion but recognition, sharp and immediate. She had spent years watching for the moment the curse might crack. She knew what it looked like when it did. He tried to speak. Her name was the only thing that came. Elara. Then nothing. Only tears. The Alpha King who had commanded armies and settled wars and never once, in anyone's memory, wept in public, lowered his head to the floor of a village gathering hall and wept in front of farmers and healers and children and the woman he had spent 7 years not seeing. Not because he had lost her. Not because she might never forgive him. But because he finally understood what she had endured, and understanding was so much worse than ignorance. Because understanding meant it was his to carry now. All of it. Every morning. Every flower. Every smile she had offered a man who couldn't see her face. Elara did not run to him. She stood frozen, one hand pressed against her chest, held in place by 7 years of carefully maintained survival. Then small feet crossed the floor. Lyra knelt in front of him. Her tiny hand touched his cheek. Don't cry, she whispered. He covered her hand with his. Carefully. As though it were made of something precious. I am sorry, he said. Not to Elara. To Lyra. To the child who had inherited his eyes and his blood and none of his presence. I am so sorry. She didn't understand all of it. Not yet. But she understood enough. Children often understood more than they could name. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck, and Kael held his daughter for the first time, held her as though holding something he had not known he was capable of wanting, with the reverence of someone who had arrived very late to a miracle. Across the room, Elara watched. And for the first time, her face did not close against him. The months that followed were not perfect. Healing never was. There were days Elara still turned away when he came too close. Days Kael reached for a memory and found only the shame of what surrounded it. Days Lyra asked questions that reopened wounds no apology could close, and he had to sit with her honesty and resist the urge to make himself look better than he had been. But there were also mornings when Elara allowed him to walk beside her to the healer's cottage, not touching, not speaking necessarily, just present in a way that had come to feel earned rather than assumed. Evenings when Lyra fell asleep against his shoulder and he stayed motionless beside her until the candle burned low. Afternoons when he helped grind herbs and Elara corrected his technique with the same quiet patience she seemed to bring to everything. The village stopped watching him like an intruder. Slowly. Unevenly. Over many weeks. The woman in the brown shawl who had told him he shouldn't be there eventually greeted him by name. Brindes continued being difficult, which he had come to understand was her version of approval. Elara stopped speaking to him like a stranger. Kael stopped trying to earn forgiveness in large, visible gestures and learned to build trust in small ones. A basket carried without being asked. A roof repaired before the rain came. A preference remembered, that she took her tea without honey, that she preferred the south-facing window for her reading, that she never slept well when the wind came from the east. He learned to notice. That was the whole of it, really. The entire work of those months, distilled, learning to notice. Learning that love was not proven by arriving. It was proven by paying attention. And then the harvest moon rose over the village, and the healers hung lanterns between the ash trees and set tables beneath the open sky for the seasonal gathering, and children ran barefoot through the grass while music drifted through the cool air. Kael sat at the end of one table with Lyra drowsing against his side. Her hand rested over his wrist with the unself-conscious trust of a child who had decided to let him in. He did not move for nearly an hour. He would not have traded that hour for a kingdom. Across from him, Elara poured tea. The movement was quiet. Ordinary. The kind of gesture that disappeared into the fabric of an evening. Then she reached into the small basket beside her chair and took out a flower. A single bluebell. She set it beside his plate. The world went still inside him. For 7 years, she had done this. Every morning, every season, through every iteration of a hope he had failed to meet. And here, beneath the harvest moon, she had done it again, not out of habit, but out of something more deliberate. Something that required decision. Kael looked at the flower for a long time. Then at the hand that had placed it. Then at her. Not as a maid who had served him. Not as a ghost made of absence and 7 years of what should have been. Not as a debt he owed or a wrong he had to right. As Elara, who had loved him, and lost herself in the loving, and rebuilt herself in the leaving, and sat across from him now in the lantern light with more grace than he had any right to receive from her. He picked up the bluebell. Slowly. Carefully. Elara's eyes followed the movement. He leaned across the table. And placed the flower behind her ear. His fingers trembled. Not from fear. From the reverence of finally doing, for the first time, consciously, deliberately, something that honored what she had always offered. She looked at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled. Small. Tired. Beautiful. Real. The smile of someone who had lived through something and come out the other side still capable of this. Kael smiled back. Lyra stirred against his side but did not wake. The lantern swayed above them. The music continued. The village moved around them in its quiet harvest evening, ordinary and full of life. And for the first time in 7 years, nothing important went unnoticed. For 7 years, she had waited for him to see her. Now he never looked away.